and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Today I'm delighted to be introducing father and son Cliff and Euan Hague, who are here to give a talk called Stories of a Lifetime in 2000 Football Programmes. Just to say that Euan is in Chicago and Cliff is in Edinburgh, so fingers crossed Zoom, this amazing technology, will work smoothly for us today. Cliff started collecting football programmes when he was a boy in Manchester in the 1950s. He is now Emeritus Professor at Heriot-Watt University, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, Chairman of the Coburn Association, and the author of Programmes, Football and the Life from Wartime to Lockdown, that was published in August by Pitch Publishing. Euan Hague was known by his match-going friends in the 1980s for keeping a programme in pristine condition tucked into his jacket as the rain poured down at grounds across central Scotland. He is now a St Vincent de Paul Professor of Geography at DePaul University in Chicago, where he is Director of the School of Public Service. But before handing over to Cliff and Euan, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So get thinking and just type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Euan and Cliff.
Good morning. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So, Dad, you wrote this book about our boxes and boxes of football programs. What got you started collecting programs?
I guess I just fell into it as a kid. I went to football matches, I bought a program, and for some reason, I didn't throw it out. I often stuck them into a scrapbook, as you can see with the Preston North End one in the middle there with the sellotape holding down the corners. As Kenny said, I was brought up in Manchester, so I mainly watched United, and the image on the left is from United against Everton, a game that I went to when I was 10. I remember it because I was allowed to go with a school friend across the city by ourselves to watch the match. I don't think that would happen today. And when you look at that, it's fascinating to see that cartoon down in the bottom left there, because this fantasizes about what happens when television takes over football. And it fantasizes that the treasurer, Walter Crickmore, with no crowds and no shillings to count, will simply bank the check from the television companies. And that, of course, is pretty much what happened last year with the lockdown. As well as watching United, I also watched City. That's an image of their ground in the 1950s. And that program also tells about how difficult it was to show highlights on TV because film had to be flown down to London in time to get it out for the evening programs.
Here's a few other early from the 1950s, and I think you've told me the personal connections you had to some of the people who played in some of these games, and also you just wrote to clubs and said, please can I have a program? I'm a 10-year-old kid in Manchester.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't get the Chelsea program in that way. That came through a friend who was older than me, 10 or more years older than me, and passed that on. But the England-Wales Schoolboy International 1954, I was at that game because the England goalkeeper that day was at the same school as me, Joe Dean, who went on to have a career with mainly with Carlisle United, but also played in what was then the English First Division for Bolton Wanderers, just a few months basically after this appearance at Main Road. The Ireland v England game at Windsor Park. The story on that one really is that a school friend, by this stage I was, 13, at this 14, at this stage, a school friend lived round the corner from Wilf McGuinness. Wilf McGuinness still lived in Blakely area of Manchester, and he was playing for United, and this was his first cap for England. And my friend Spud Martin went round the corner the night or two before the game and asked, would he bring us a programme back? So that programme was brought back by Wilf McGuinness, who played in the match. And I think it just shows how in those days in the 1950s, you know, star players with top clubs, internationals, were still living in quite ordinary areas of Manchester, by no means in the ranch houses and mansions that dot the skyline of Cheshire today.
Right. And of course, McGuinness is playing, he's one of the Busby Babes, and this is happening, this England game is 6 months after the tragedy of the 1958 Munich air crash, which you must remember well.
Absolutely, yeah. McGuinness was lucky enough not to be on the plane because he was injured. Otherwise, he would have certainly been there. He was the regular reserve at left half for Duncan Edwards in those days. So yeah, the Munich crash was quite devastating, really. I was 13 at the time. I had all the team photos on my wall that I'd grown up watching these players. And I was actually in the Barbers when the news came through. Somebody came in the Barbers and shouted out that the United plane had crashed. And it was just hardly believable. And this is the programme for the game. You meet just a couple of weeks after that, the cup tie against Sheffield Wednesday. As you can see, a very famous programme, this one, because United literally did not know who they were going to put out as a team. The cover, instead of usually the name of the game would be in red, it was all in black, and inside it included this page with the 7 players who at that stage had died. And sadly, of course, and most tragically of all perhaps, Duncan Edwards died just a few days after that.
Yeah. So then I think, you know, I get involved here, and we've jumped forward. Well, we jumped backwards 20 years and jumped forward 40 years. So I think when I started as a teenager collecting them, I was buy the oldest program that I could for the amount of money I had. And so somewhere along the road, I bought Dulwich Hamlet, who played in pink and blue against Erith and Belvedere. I have no idea what this program is here for, Dad. Why did you, what was, I mean, this is a 1-page sheet, I guess, but I think this kind of triggered you writing the book when Mum told you to throw out our programs, right?
That's right. Yeah, you can see it's written on it 43, 44. So this is October 1943, before I was born. But more than anything that triggered me to write the book, when I was looking through them to explain to your mother that some of these things were actually valuable. And of course, some of them were really your programs rather than my programs. I spotted this, and you can see it down this part of it, underneath the referee and the linesman. Supporters will probably know that the Football Association ruling that about stoppage of games only in the event of enemy aircraft overhead will play be stopped. Shelter is provided under the stand. Entrances each end of the enclosure facing the playing pitch. So I had this image immediately shot in my mind of a side that's 2-0 down with 5 minutes to go, and the captain tugging the referee's arm and saying, "Oh, I think I can hear an air raid siren, ref," and the referee simply looking up at the sky, seeing no sign of the Luftwaffe, and saying, "Play on, man." And I thought this was so definitive of the notion of keep calm and carry on, but also at another level, a kind of really poignant reminder of the conditions of life that people were watching football in. And even more so when I realized it was the same day that in Rome, the roundup of Jews began. So while this game was going on in suburban London, you know, Jews were being rounded up for concentration camps in Rome. So I thought it really carried a lot of messages, not just as a bit of paper that you picked up, spending your hard-earned paper round money, but also of much wider currents in our society and the world at that time. And then, of course, you go off to the States and you leave all the programs here.
Yeah, yeah, and I add to them by sending them back in the post, right? So this is a US v Scotland game I went to. It was a really weird place. It was like in the back of a high school. You can actually find the highlights on YouTube, but it was almost like the players drove up, parked their cars, and walked onto the field. You know, it was really just a totally different atmosphere than the big stadiums and big grounds in Britain that I was used to when I moved to the United States. Here's some old ones. Here's some early Scottish ones that we have. I know the Hearts one on the left here. Mum had a friend at church in Edinburgh who was an elderly man, and when I was like 14 or 15, he gave me a big collection of Hearts programs because I was supporting Hearts and still am. And so we have a big group of sort of 1950s Hearts programs. But I went to Hibs games as well. But these are from before you moved to Scotland.
Yeah, I think these were collected by writing off to the clubs. The Hearts program's interesting because it also goes even further back in time with the story of a player who in the 1890s was a star for Hearts, but also was regularly seen, as it says in the program, atop a cart full of turnips out Gorgie way, where they were farmers. And I guess, you know, stories of midfield stars at 4 a.m. nowadays are more likely to be about a disco or a nightclub than about a cart full of turnips. But yeah, you know, I collected programs from clubs, and I think the Hibs one is a very nice image on the front there.
Yeah, I remember going to Hibs games in the 70s and that big standing terrace on the side of the ground. I think the other thing that comes through in the book, and actually you can really see it in the programs as well, and this is what makes them interesting as historical objects, is, you know, they're meant to be ephemeral, but they trace the change of Britain through the 1950s and through to today, of course. So here we have the beginning of floodlights, and then this famous England-Hungary game. I think we can obviously spot the Union Jack next to England's name on that one, but this famous England-Hungary game from the early 1950s. And you must have, I think you must have watched that on television, right?
I just got home from school in time to see Alf Ramsey score a penalty that made it 6-3 for
Hungary.
Yes. So yeah, this was quite a pivotal moment in my life, actually, because even in the program, there's articles saying, well, you know, these continentals, you know, that they're very slick, but really the British style of football is best. And of course, famously in that game, England are 1-0 down after 45 seconds to the Olympic champions who'd been on a huge unbeaten run. Just on the Union Jacks, yeah, they appear on cup final programs for a long time as well, on all Wembley programs, I think, for a long time. Floodlights change things as well. Floodlights and television interact because the league wouldn't allow clubs to play league matches under floodlights. So to get back the money that they invested in floodlights, clubs played a lot of midweek friendlies against international opposition. So this one here, Arsenal against Hibs, actually Arsenal won 7-1. But another interesting bit in that, it's got the league tables in from that time, October 1952. And who's top of the Scottish A division? East Fife.
East Fife, the glory years of the.
Absolutely, yeah, they had a very strong side in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Shows how much, you know, the kind of wealth in the game has been unevenly distributed and disadvantaged smaller clubs and smaller nations.
And this middle one is probably, it looks like Dynamo Moscow or somebody. Dynamo.
Yeah,
Kiev,
against
maybe?
Wolves. Dynamo Moscow playing Wolves. And the cartoonists, very often the cartoonists were a little bit insensitive. I mean, the charge of the Light Brigade may not be the best starting point for a game between a British club and a Russian club, but it's this pun on the idea of lights and the dynamos.
I think I mean, Queen of the South, I have no idea why we have Queen of the South versus Celtic from 1958. But I think, again, the great thing about this is this changing, the beginning of kind of, you know, consumerism in Britain at the time. Yeah,
as I say, the arrival of TV and particularly ITV and floodlighting, you know, they feed off each other in a sense. So this is a fairly typical, it's from a Queen's South program, but it could be, you'd find similar things in many other programs at that stage. You know, the arrival of mass television, and you know, you can see the size of it there. It's roughly the size of a small fridge that the guy's carrying in. and behind him the youth with the HG aerial to go up on the roof. And of course, all these companies producing the TVs, they're all being produced at that stage by UK manufacturers.
Right, and so I think one of the things that we'll talk about and we'll see in the other programs is a sort of transition from domestic to global television as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the television interplay goes on right through from wartime to the present day. Yeah.
So you moved to Scotland in the late 1960s. We don't have your first Old Firm game, although you talk about it in the book.
Yeah,
what was it like to go to Celtic versus Rangers in 1968?
It was an overwhelming experience. I arrived too late. I went with my friend Hugh from Newcastle. We arrived too late because Hugh had forgotten the tickets, so we were too late to get a program. So we got in, we squeezed into the terrace, absolute packed house, tickets shared 50-50. So the noise was absolutely overwhelming, and the game ebbed and flowed. Rangers finally sealed it with a goal in the last minute to make it 4-2. But it was a really amazing experience, even having been brought up in watching United, going down at times, you know, to the London clubs and things like that. But still, I'd never seen anything quite like that. In particular, I was quite stunned by the fact that everybody around me had a whiskey in one hand and a can of lager in the other hand. I hadn't really seen that in other places. But yeah, it was a pulsating game, really exciting. Celtic, of course, were not long since European champions. Rangers were a prominent European team. So the next week, I thought, this is really great. I'll go to another Scottish Division 1 game, which was Clyde against Wraith Rovers. And suddenly I was in a totally different world of a kind of, you know, pretty empty terrace and the sun shining, and the pace was nothing like that. And I got the program for that. That was no problem. And I think there's things that strikes me, and I mentioned in the book, is the heavy sugar emphasis that you get. The adverts are always interesting in programs, but here you are, that, you know, try the fruitiest full sugar drink, Dunsade, and buy Walker's sugar produced in Scotland. And then
for health and vigor, it says.
Yeah, for health and vigor, that's right. Yeah, so it gives you a bit of an insight into the diet of people in Scotland in the late 60s. The Hampden program, that was my first visit to Hampden, and again, another just amazing experience to be in the ground and see how huge it was, the biggest stadium I'd been in at that stage, and memorable game because of a brilliant Dennis Law header at the back post.
And then you moved to Edinburgh, and I'm born in 1971, so I don't know if I'm around for decimalization. I don't remember Old Penstead, but I think one of the things that we see here is this sort of transition, beginning of the transition to, for want of a better phrase, you know, coming out of the post-war Britain into, you know, late 20th century Britain with this shift to decimalization. Absolutely,
decimalization and inflation. The two, to some extent, were interconnected, although the main inflation comes with the oil crisis just a couple of years later. But here we are, Hibs playing Dundee. The one on the left is a couple of weeks after the official decimalisation date in mid-February 1971. And you can see the programme there is still priced at 6p, that's 6D, 6 old pence. A couple of weeks later, no, I think it's the Wednesday after, actually, they play Morton in a midweek game. And the equivalent price, 6 old pence, is 2.5 newspence, so that's it. But a couple of weeks after that, in another programme I'm not showing on the slide, that the price has gone up to 3 new pence. And by the start of the next season, when they play Falkirk, you can see there that the price is 5 new pence. So that's a sort of, you know, doubling of the price of a programme in a matter of months. And that pattern continues, really. So there's decimalisation, obviously an important milestone in British history, but also shown in these football programmes as actually feeding inflation at that time. Nice
Here's
as well. And yeah, there's throughout the 60s, it really follows on from what we're saying about the TV and the consumerism. You know, there's plenty of jobs, and this is Sheffield Wednesday programme game I went to at Hillsborough. But this kind of advert appears also in Doncaster Rovers, Nottingham Forest, all the coalfield places advertising, you know, a career for you in coal, one with a real future. And basically, they basically tell you to turn up, present yourself there, and you know you're going to get a job. And it's true for other industries as well. Also, of course, part of that consumerism, the better wages, people getting at last recovering from very slow recovery after the war, but wealth begins to percolate through, and people begin to buy cars. And again, 50s, 60s programs got a lot of cars advertised, which look quite quaint nowadays. And there's one story in a Millwall program of a player who had itchy feet after scoring a cup tie. And the club basically gave him a sort of bonus, which he used to buy a Ford Zephyr. And the manager talked about this as really the kind of top-notch experience of the day. And Ford Zephyr was a kind of British version of American gas guzzlers, basically, not so big, but still pretty much the same. So there's that period where the programs reflect an era of available jobs at good wages and a secure future.
Back into Scotland in the early 1970s, and just look at the pitch at Tynecastle here. It looks like an ice rink. But what I think the highlight with this one is, again, that kind of industrial Britain coming to an end. I mean, absolutely, I think the manager writes is a little more, a little less about tactics on this one.
Yeah, I mean, those people who'd gone into mining from the Sheffield Wednesday programme perhaps a few years before this were now on strike. And this leads into the 3-day week in the early 70s, which desperately affects football. As you can see, the manager says these are difficult times for football clubs. It's not just the weather that's causing havoc, but the power situation. So games were kicking off at, like, as you can see here,
2 p.m.
2 o'clock or even 1:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. And the crowds, as the manager there says, were really pathetic. It was a real time of crisis. And of course, this came after a long drain away of crowds from football games because there were basically other attractions. Women were beginning to expect men to do something other than go to the football match on a Saturday afternoon. So there was this real crisis hanging over football, but which was part of a much wider national confrontation between organised labour and the government over issues of pay at a time of rising inflation.
It's amazing you can tell this history through the programs, and here's 3 that I remember. So January 1978, I would have been 7, and this is the first game you took me, Hearts Dundee at Tynecastle, a 2-2 draw, I think. But of course, the one I really remember as well is the first Manchester United game you took me to at Old Trafford. And this actually, United versus West Brom, turns out to be a really famous game in the history of British football.
Absolutely, yeah. Do you want to talk about that one, because you know it at least?
Well, you know, I'm here in Chicago, and you know, I'll talk to some students. I teach at university, and I'll have an 18-year-old student, you know, who's invariably an Arsenal fan, and they'll ask me about the first game I went to, and obviously there's not a lot of Hearts v Dundee from 1978 on YouTube, but the United game there is. So I say it's worth 9 minutes of your time, just to see the difference, but also the game is so significant because West Brom win 5-3, and they have 3 players of Caribbean descent: Laurie Cunningham, Cyril Regis, and Brendan Batson. And you hear booing by the Manchester United fans when these players get the ball, but they just ran Manchester United ragged that day, and it really is a famous game in English/British football history, sort of elevating the players of Caribbean descent to kind of, you know, the forefront of the game. And I think, you know, people may be familiar that Laurie Cunningham tragically was killed in a car crash after moving to Real Madrid and playing in Spain. And Cyril Regis, I think, was probably one of the most. I mean, I think he probably would have played much more for England if he hadn't been black. I mean, he was a phenomenal player. And the cup final one here, this is the first cup final I remember. And again, it's a famous game. Arsenal win 3-2 with a goal in the last minute. But what I remember is, I'm looking at the date. So my sisters would be not just 1 year old and 5 years old. I'd have been 7. I'd have been 7. And I think we had to drive to the borders of Scotland to even see this game.
That's right, except for viewers in Scotland who have their own programmes at that time. This was the standard announcement that preceded any television of English football at that time in Scotland, because the FA had the right, Scottish FA had the right to black out any live coverage of games elsewhere. So we hadn't had a car through the 70s, and we just got a car and had got friends in the borders and realised that you could see the English Cup final with United playing Arsenal if we drove down to Newton St Boswell. So that's what we did with all of you lot probably fighting in the back of the car, and we went and watched it down there. I think just last word on the West Brom game. I mean, I think it's really sad that these kind of issues of racism still affect football, and we even saw earlier this year, that taking the knee was controversial for some people. And I think it's a real reminder of how tough it must have been for black players in the 1960s and 1970s. It's really in the 70s that they made their main breakthrough, and into the 80s and beyond, in terms of the discrimination that they faced.
We're back in Scotland now, and this is I don't remember anything about this game, but I remember you telling me I had to see George Best.
Yeah, I had you perched on the barrier on that big terrace you mentioned earlier at Easter Road to see this great player who I'd seen his debut for United and seen his best years there. And of course, by the time he turns up at Hibs, he's somewhat past his best, but still capable of outstanding moments. And there was one such in that game where he suddenly hit a pass from about 50 yards, which the Hibs striker collected and blasted wide, if I remember rightly. But what do you think of Arthur Duncan's natty sweater, Euan? Would you like one of them?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would have worn it, but this is also the beginning of kind of merchandising beyond football, right? Because you've got here t-shirts for children, pennants, and various other ideas for stocking fillers. This is the December, the first game you can see here. Other kids, old kids' favorites, teddy bears in all sizes and club colors. So complete with the club badge and maker's insignia. This is the beginning of branded sports leisure wear.
That's right. Yeah, changing fashion trends. Previously, sweaters were just sweaters. They didn't have logos or anything like that. So it really is, again, a further stage economically and commercially in the way that brands are developed and become eventually, the football clubs themselves and even the players become brands, as we now know.
So we're into the 1980s now, and I didn't go to either of these games. I was living in London in March 1990 for this Scotland-Argentina game. So I think I went to England, Brazil on maybe that week or soon after.
Yeah, the Scotland-Brazil one, I included.
Scotland-Argentina.
Scotland-Argentina, sorry, yeah. I included really because of this advert, be your own boss. Unemployed, want to be your own boss. This is, as you say, we're now the end of the 1980s, and the contrast with those adverts from the 60s of, secure jobs in coal, employment opportunities widespread, growing leisure, growing disposable incomes. What you've now got is the sharp political change. If you're unemployed, the way out of it is to be your own boss, and you can get £40 a week for a year. But you must be receiving unemployment benefit or income support, be unemployed for at least 8 weeks, lots of people were, and raise £1,000 to invest in your business. That might have been more difficult for people. The other one on the left is also redolent of that period of the 1980s, because that's the Falklands War Cup final. Tottenham Hotspur, of course, had 2 star players from Argentina, Ricky Villas and Ozzy Ardiles. And in the semi-final, which took place the day after the invasion by Argentina of the Falklands, Ardiles had been booed from the moment that he went on the pitch, even booed by some of his own supporters, and every time he touched the ball. And he decided at that point to return to Argentina for, in quote marks, pre-World Cup training. But there was no doubt that he left because of the hostility and the difficult situation he was in. Villa stuck around a little bit longer, but although they feature in the team photograph, they've basically not there when you get to the cup final.
And the reason we have all these English FA Cup finals is because when I started collecting, one of the cup finals were kind of the premier program of each season, and you could get them in newsagents as well all over the UK. So I think what I tried to do was get every post-World War II cup final. I think that was one of my collecting strategies. We need to accelerate a little bit, but we have some international ones. And I know that you personally had some connections to what was then Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, I was doing quite a lot of research there in the 1980s and then training in the 1990s, but this was before then. And I think this was probably one that you bought. But it's interesting, Czechoslovakia against Scotland, World Cup qualifier 1976. And the advert on the inside page there is shown on the right. For those of you who are not fluent in Czech, it's basically for a magazine about Czechoslovakian Soviet cultural, scientific and technological cooperation. And the text below it talks about the magazine aiming to combat anti-Sovietism and anti-communism. So it's
and this is only 8 years, right? This is only 8 years after
8 years after the Prague Spring has been brutally put down. So yeah, it's again a kind of very sharp political statement, really, in an ordinary football program.
Throughout the 80s, of course, it was, and into the 90s, it was mainly Hearts games that I was going to. But I think one of the things that came together in the 80s was the idea of the edge of city stadium, and the stadium moving from being in a sort of compact neighborhood. This is me and you talking planning, Dad. But moving from those compact central city stadia to these kind of edge of city leisure and entertainment complexes. And this was the effort by Hearts to build out on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and the artist's impression of how the new stadium would look with car parking space aplenty.
Yeah, that's right. The article was written by Wallace Mercer, who, of course, was a property developer who owned Hearts. And as you rightly say, part of the deregulation of the 80s saw a boom in out-of-town developments, edge city developments. And so Mercer used the Hearts programme to pitch to the fans the need to support his planning application to build initially at Miller Hill on the east of the city, because the traffic congestion at Tynecastle was just so bad that you couldn't possibly stay there. He sets up a stadium development company, but he's also seeking to build hotels, housing, retail, etc., and something that he called interactive landscaping, which I'm still not quite sure what that was. But what he never told the punters was that this is actually a greenbelt site. It's something that developers often have difficulty with recognizing. So first of all, he tried to relocate them to way away from Tynecastle to Miller Hill. And then he tried after that to relocate on the west of the city. And there's another program where he explains that basically, you know, it would be only a fool would try and locate on the east side of the city, locate Hart on the east side of the city, which is exactly what he'd done. But it's still, again, it's the same story. It's a greenbelt site, and in both cases, planning permission was refused. And as we know, Hearts are still at Tynecastle. The other program, Slavia Prague, by this stage, it really links back to the Czech thing. By 1992, when Hearts are playing Slavia, who was a team I used to watch when I went to Prague, Slavia by that stage are owned by an American entrepreneur, and he's basically putting people in the shop window. His business plan was basically, you know, get good players in from Eastern Europe, put them in a European shop window and sell them on. And I think one of those was the guy who played for Liverpool, Patrick Berger, who he sold to a German club and then on to Liverpool.
Okay, now again, here's a couple. Again, these are games I went to. I don't remember. You know more. You remember going to this one in Denmark. When we went on a holiday in Denmark, and I guess we went to a few games. And I think I think I went to this one by myself on the left, and then the Scotland-France game I remember because it was pouring with rain at Hampden.
Yeah, it may be selective amnesia, you and the one on the left, because you did go by yourself. We did a house swap with, because we had a university link with Aarhus Architecture School. And we went on from there to Copenhagen, and you went this one by yourself, but you actually went to the wrong place because you'd misread it. And so you turned up at a ground where the game was not, and had to relocate and make your way to actually see Peter Schmeichel keeping goal for Brøndby in this game against, I don't know quite how you pronounce that, Brøndby. The France game I also remember. I remember the rain, standing on the open terrace at the Celtic end of Hampden, because again, we were linked in with the European exchange, as I say, which included University College Dublin, as well as Architecture School Aarhus. And I drove the university minibus with you and probably a couple of pals, but mainly a group of students from these two universities to see this match. And we got back in the van afterwards, absolutely soaked to the skin. And I sat in the driving seat. A young woman from Dublin sat next to me. And then the third seat on the bench at the front was occupied by a male from Denmark, who proceeded to take his jeans off because they were absolutely soaked. And the look on this Irish woman's face, who I guess had never quite seen that sort of behavior in late 1980s Ireland, was something to behold. So yeah, it was an exercise in European understanding.
And Scotland won that game 2-0. I remember. I think Mo Johnson was on the cover. Yeah. So we're coming up to the modern day now. Did you want to talk about these two? I mean, you wouldn't even notice this one from the Premier League a couple of years ago is even a program. It looks more like a magazine. It's glossy as well. And this one from summer of 1999 looks like a Manchester United game against somebody in Asia. Yeah,
this is part of the globalization process. By the mid 90s. You can, again, it's in the book, you can read it in the programs, the club executives are saying, look, we can really grow our markets here. They're selling the merchandise, but one of the ways to sell it and to hook people into the credit cards and everything else is to go on tour. So clubs were going on tour to distant locations. And this one is a game in Hong Kong. And you can see the central image there, David Beckham, who even at that stage has become a brand that's selling the connection. That program's also interesting because of some of the adverts for financial dealing that you get, and offering, good access to tax-free locations and things like that. So you get this transition from industrial Britain to financial Britain, and then a globalized financial system. And then, yes, I mean, the shirt sponsors on the Wolves program there on the right from 2019, like many others, the shirt sponsor now isn't as it was in the early 90s, where it was mainly tech companies. People like Sharp or others like that. But now it's basically offshore gambling companies. And of course, the internet has facilitated this. So everybody can bet on whether the Albanian wingback gets a yellow card in the next 10 minutes. And you can do that, whether you're in Thailand or Wolverhampton.
And this, I think, is the most recent game either of us went to. I went about a month ago to Soldier Field here in Chicago, and this is the entire program, Dad. It is the game on the front and the list of players on the back. It's literally a piece of paper, piece of cardboard. And so I think, just a difference. They still have the few adverts, but they're really for the next games and so forth. I mean, I guess you're meant to look up the player profiles on your phone.
Yeah, also, of course, it's got an advert for Hispanic Night, which, as you know, far better than me, taps into the very significant role of Hispanic communities in football in USA. But yeah, it was kind of you to send it over here to the collection. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good that all the collection is in boxes behind you rather than in boxes behind me. So I think, what the book really does is sort of, and here's me and you at Tynecastle with my daughters, your grandchildren, are sort of, maybe they can begin collecting the programs.
Well, I look to you to enthuse them. Yeah, so there's the book. There's a lot more in it than what we've been able to talk in the time, but we hope that we've entertained you and that you've learned a bit about how you can make stories really that are there, hidden in the programs, just waiting to be discovered, and how what look like tatty bits of paper actually tell the story of my life, of your life, Euan, but also of a generation and a country or countries going through a long period of transition from the depths of World War II to the kind of globalized internet-based age that we now live in.